Before El Salvador invaded Honduras, Salvadoran families were already being beaten, robbed, and pushed across the border. Then the world blamed a football match. I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Lorda, from Latin America's history to mysteries and true crime to local legends. Hit subscribe. Fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. Did a war really begin because a ball crossed a line? Or did the ball only roll across a wound that was already open? That is the trap in the name football war. It sounds like a joke. History tells when it wants to make Latin America look dramatic and irrational. A goal, a flag, then bombs, but come closer. The grass was not the battlefield. The border was, the land was, the poor were. The year was 1969. Two neighboring countries, El Salvador and Honduras, were pulled into a short, brutal conflict that lasted about 100 hours. The world remembers the football matches. The families remembered the roads, the homes left behind. The farms were taken, the sound of crowds becoming mobs, the smell of smoke in villages where no referee had ever blown a whistle. A war can last 4 days and still echo for generations. The first lie is that football caused everything. The second lie is that football meant nothing. The truth sits in the dangerous middle. The matches did not create the hatred, but they gave it a face. They gave politicians a chant. They gave newspapers a funeral. They gave frightened people a story simple enough to shout. When a nation is already shaking, a stadium can become more than a stadium. It can become an altar. Look at the map first. El Salvador is small, dense, pressed tight between sea, mountains, and old estates. Honduras is larger, greener, and has more visible space on the map. Still, it is not the paradise that desperate people imagined. In 1969, El Salvador had about 3.7 million people. Honduras had about 2.6 million. On paper, Honduras looked like a room to landless Salvadoran families. It looked like a second chance. But land in Central America has never been just land. Land is memory with a fence around it. Land is hunger given a boundary. Land is who eats, who leaves, who kneels, and who gives orders from the shade. In El Salvador, too much land sat in too few hands. Coffee and cotton estates swallowed the possibility. Poor farmers lived close to the soil but far from ownership, working land that would never call them by name. So Salvadorans crossed into Honduras, not as an army, not with flags and rifles. They came as workers, peasant farmers, mothers, fathers, children, families with bundles, tools, seed, and fear. Many settled in rural zones near the border and farther inside Honduras. Some had papers, some did not. Some had lived there for years. They cleared land, planted crops, opened small shops, raised children, and tried to turn foreign ground into home. And wait, notice this. Honduras was not rich simply because it was larger. Its own poor people were also hungry for land. Honduran farmers looked around and saw Salvadoran settlers working fields, running shops, building lives. Politicians and landowners saw an opportunity. The old trick began to work again. When the poor ask why they have nothing, point them toward another poor man and say, "There is your thief." Hunger was taught to look sideways. Under President Oswaldo López Arellano, Honduras was also a military-led country under pressure. Its government faced angry farmers, economic strain, and the need to prove it was defending Honduran land. Agrarian reform and immigration enforcement in the late 1960s became sharp tools. In theory, land reform could mean justice. In practice, Salvadoran settlers became easy targets. Their farms could be questioned. Their presence could be denounced. Their homes could be treated like weeds. The violence did not wait for the final whistle. Salvadorans in Honduras were already being harassed, robbed, beaten, and expelled before the war began. Some farms were seized or burned. Some families were forced toward the border under threat. Some fled before the mobs arrived. The police and military were not always the ones swinging the stick. Still, sometimes the state only needs to look away for terror to feel official. This is the part the meme buries. Before soldiers crossed the border, civilians were already being pushed across it. Salvadorans were dragged into a storm made of land resentment, nationalism, and political convenience. The records whisper of beatings, threats, property seizures, and forced expulsions. Not every story was written cleanly. Impoverished people often die or flee in places where paperwork arrives late, but the pattern was clear enough. The violence had roots deeper than sport. El Salvador, too, was ruled by men in uniform wearing civilian clothes. Its president, Fidel Sánchez Hernández, came from the military world, and the ruling party was closely tied to the armed forces. This mattered because poor Salvadorans had long memories. In 1932, El Salvador's military crushed an uprising of indigenous people and peasant farmers. The killing was remembered as a massacre, a warning carved into the national soul. Ask too loudly for land, and the state may answer with bullets. So when Sanchez Hernandez suddenly spoke as the defender of poor Salvadorans across the border, there was something bitter in it. The suffering was real. Salvadoran migrants really were being attacked and expelled in Honduras. But governments can use real grief like a drum. The same Salvadoran state that had failed the landless at home now discovered their pain abroad could be wrapped in the flag and turned into unity. Inside El Salvador, the return of expelled migrants threatened to become a domestic crisis. Where would these people go? What land would receive them? What work would feed them? Migration to Honduras had been a release valve for a crowded and unequal country. When Honduras pushed Salvadorans back, that valve broke. The pressure turned inward, and the Salvadoran government needed the pressure to point outward again. The border became a mirror too dangerous to ignore. There was more beneath the floorboards. The Central American Common Market, created to make the region trade like a family, had become another source of resentment. El Salvador's stronger industrial sector seemed to benefit more than Honduras did. Border disputes still lingered like old ghosts, including arguments over territory and the waters around the Gulf of Fonseca. These countries were neighbors. Yes, but neighbors can carry old knives behind polite doors. Then came football. Beautiful, dangerous football. In Latin America, the game can be childhood, neighborhood, memory, fathers at radios, mothers shouting at screens, and old men arguing like prophets. But when the national team walks onto the field, many people do not see 11 players. They see the flag-wearing human bodies. They see the nation running, sweating, suffering. A goal becomes joy. A loss becomes an insult. A dirty tackle becomes an invasion. In June of 1969, El Salvador and Honduras met in qualifying matches for the 1970 World Cup. 3 matches, 3 chances for a sport to pretend it was separate from politics. But the air was already poisoned. Every insult had a country attached to it. Every chant had a border behind it. Every newspaper knew the crowd wanted a villain. Football did not light the first fire, but it brought the fire into the open. The first match was played in Tegucigalpa, Honduras on June 8, 1969. The night before, Honduran fans gathered outside the hotel where the Salvadoran team was trying to sleep. They beat tin pans, rattled barrels, shouted, sang, and set off firecrackers. Imagine the players inside, staring at the ceiling, hearing a whole city refuse them rest. At another time, it might have been a matter of gamesmanship. In that moment, it felt like a siege. The next day, Honduras won 1-0 with a late goal, the kind of goal that feels like a dagger because it arrives when hope is tired. Salvadorans felt humiliated. Hondurans felt triumphant. But the score was not allowed to remain a score. The match became evidence. Each side took what it wanted from the field. Honduras saw proof of strength. El Salvador saw insult, mistreatment, and robbery dressed in football boots. Then a dead girl entered the story. Or maybe only the story of a dead girl did. Her name was Emilia Bolaños, and popular accounts said she was a young Salvadoran woman who took her own life after the defeat. Newspapers and later retellings turned her into a national martyr, a daughter of the homeland who could not bear humiliation. But the evidence grows cold around her. Later searches failed to confirm the life behind the legend. That is what makes the Emilia story so dangerous. She may have been real, misreported, exaggerated, or made almost entirely from ink and national grief. But whether she lived as described or not, the symbol worked. A football loss was dressed in funeral clothes. A young woman became a mirror where a nation saw its wounded pride. When politics needs a martyr, sometimes it finds one. Sometimes it prints one. The second match came on June 15th in San Salvador. This time, the Honduran team arrived as guests of the enemy. The night before the game, Salvadoran crowds turned the hotel into another battlefield. Accounts speak of broken windows, rotten things thrown inside, sleepless players, fear pressing against the walls. The pattern repeated, but now the anger had grown teeth. The visitors were not only rivals, they were representatives of the country accused of attacking Salvadoran families. On game day, Honduran players were taken to the stadium under heavy protection. The crowd was no longer just a crowd, it was a wave waiting to break. When the Honduran anthem played, the flag was disrespected and burned. That mattered. A flag is only cloth until people pour ancestors into it. Then it becomes mothers, graves, schoolchildren, soldiers, mountains, and the dream that a country has of itself. El Salvador won 3-0, a clean victory on the field. But outside the field, nothing was clean. Honduran fans were attacked. Vehicles heading back toward Honduras became targets. 2 Honduran supporters were reportedly killed. News traveled fast, and rumor traveled faster. By the time the story reached Honduras, it was no longer information. It arrived as a match thrown into dry grass. The retaliation would not wait politely. In Honduras, mobs turned against Salvadorans. Shops were vandalized in cities like San Pedro Sula and Tegucigalpa. Homes were broken into, families were beaten, robbed, and threatened. Some houses burned. Salvadorans who had lived in Honduras for years suddenly became foreign invaders in the mouths of men who had known their names. The violence wore the mask of patriotism, but its hands were busy taking land, goods, dignity, and safety. Imagine one family on one road, a mother holding a child, a father carrying papers he hopes still mean something, a sack of clothes, a few tools, maybe a rooster tied by the legs. Behind them, a field they cleared by hand. Ahead of them, El Salvador is crowded and uncertain. They are told they are going home, but what is home when the land that fed you is behind you and the land ahead has no space? The Salvadoran government called for international attention and accused Honduras of failing to protect Salvadoran citizens. In this, there was truth. Salvadorans in Honduras were being attacked. But the truth was also useful. Sanchez Hernandez could now present himself as the father of the wounded nation. Domestic criticism could be drowned beneath patriotic anger. The poor, ignored for years, became sacred once their suffering could point toward an enemy across the border. Honduras had its own story. Lopez Arellano's government could say it was defending national land and Honduran farmers. Many Hondurans believed Salvadorans had taken jobs, fields, and opportunities. Some feared their country was being quietly swallowed by migrants. That fear was not born from nowhere, but it can be easily trained. Instead of asking why land remained unequal and why foreign companies and local elites held so much power, people were told to look to the Salvadoran neighbor. The decisive match came in Mexico City at the end of June on neutral ground, a place away from Tegucigalpa, away from San Salvador, away from the burned flag and broken hotels. But neutrality is hard when the crowd has already moved into the blood. Around that same turning point, El Salvador broke diplomatic relations with Honduras, accusing it of failing to protect Salvadoran citizens. El Salvador won 3-2 after extra time. The match gave El Salvador a path toward the World Cup, but not the final ticket yet. That would come later, after defeating Haiti. Still, the victory mattered. The score became glory at the exact moment the border was becoming fire. After the Mexico City match, El Salvador broke diplomatic relations with Honduras. The official language spoke of citizens attacked, crimes unpunished, and a neighbor that had failed in its duty. Behind that language stood troop movements, military preparations, and leaders who understood that national anger had reached the point where war could be sold as a form of protection. Both countries prepared for conflict with strange old weapons. Pilots flew piston-engine aircraft from another era, machines that looked like ghosts of the Second World War circling above Central America. The war would become famous for its final dogfights between propeller-driven fighter planes. Imagine that, old aircraft in a new crisis, relics of distant battlefields now carrying bombs over villages, roads, and border towns where poor families had no shelter from history. On July 14, 1969, El Salvador invaded Honduras. Its air force struck targets, including the area near the airport outside Tegucigalpa. Ground forces crossed the border. The war that people would remember through football had finally left the stadium. Now there were no chance to hide behind. There was smoke, confusion, soldiers pushing through rural zones, civilians running, and commanders trying to control a fire that politics had invited but could not fully command. War has a way of stripping slogans naked. Defense of the nation becomes a child crying beside a ditch. This becomes a house burning with no soldier inside. Honor becomes a farmer shot because he was in the wrong place when fear needed a body. In the 100-Hour War, the line between combatants and civilians often blurred. Rural communities paid the price for decisions made in capitals, while cheering in stadiums, air raids, and artillery damaged the infrastructure that civilians depended on. Roads, bridges, supply routes, and border settlements became targets or obstacles. Villages in contested zones saw destruction and killings. Command was uneven. Discipline was not always strong. In fast wars, cruelty moves quickly and accountability arrives limping. The records do not always agree on every incident. Still, they agree on the shape of the suffering. Civilians were not protected from the storm. Casualty numbers vary because the dead were not counted with the care they deserved. Estimates often range from around 2,000 to 6,000 people killed, with many civilians among them. Numbers can become cold. so warm them with imagination. Each one was a kitchen gone quiet, a shirt never washed again, a child who learned too early that the flag can cover a coffin, but it cannot explain why the coffin exists. On July 18th, the Organization of American States pushed through ceasefire terms, and the 100-hour war effectively ended. But Salvadoran troops did not begin withdrawing until August 2nd. The 100-hour war ended, but its consequences had only begun. A withdrawal is not a resurrection. The dead did not return because soldiers stepped back. Burned homes did not rebuild themselves. Crops did not grow from apologies. Between 100,000 and 300,000 Salvadorans were expelled from Honduras or fled in fear. Some had lived there for years. Some had children born there. Some had no clear place to go. The war ended on paper, but the roads stayed crowded with the displaced. This mass displacement may be the story's deepest wound. A battle can be measured in hours. Exile is measured in generations. Salvadoran families lost farms, shops, tools, animals, documents, and graves. Many returned to El Salvador without land in a country already defined by land hunger. They were citizens, yes, but citizenship does not feed a child. In El Salvador, they became reminders of a problem no anthem could solve. The pattern looked like targeted expulsion, with ethnic cleansing dynamics, even when not every historian or legal source uses that formal term. People were pushed out not only because of individual actions, but also because they belonged to a marked national group. Salvadoran became a dangerous label. Their property could be taken, their bodies could be threatened, their presence could be framed as contamination. That is how ordinary neighbors are transformed into removals. And ask the old question, who benefited? Not the Salvadoran poor, who returned to a country that still had no land for them. Not the Honduran poor, who still faced inequality after Salvadorans were gone. Not the families who buried sons beneath flags. The winners were those who avoided blame. Landowners, political machines, military governments, leaders who discovered that if you aim hunger at a border, people might stop aiming it at the palace. This is why the football story survives. It is easier to say they fought over a game than to say they fought because land was unequal, migrants were scapegoated, governments were afraid, and nationalism was useful. A football war sounds absurd. A land war sounds familiar. A migrant crisis sounds modern. A propaganda war sounds too close to home. The meme lets everyone laugh and walk away before the uncomfortable part starts speaking. But the uncomfortable part is the real history. Football was not the knife. Football was the drumbeat. The knife had been sharpened in land offices, border disputes, plantation economies, military barracks, and hungry kitchens. The ball only rolled into the scene after the actors were already in costume. It gave the crowd something round and bright to follow, while darker hands moved behind the curtain. Still, football cannot be declared innocent. The matches mattered because they made private resentment public. They gathered anger into stadiums, gave it colors, songs, insults, and images. The sleepless hotel in Tegucigalpa, the broken windows in San Salvador, the burned Honduran flag, the disputed martyrdom of Emilia Bolaños, the dead fans, the mobs. These things did not cause the old wound, but they pressed on it until blood came through the bandage. The Honduran flag itself carried a bitter irony. Its stars remember the old dream of Central American unity, the sister republics once imagined as a family after the empire. Yet in 1969, those symbols stood over a conflict between neighbors whose poor had more in common with each other than with the men who ruled them. The stars remained stitched into cloth. On the ground, families were scattered as constellations kicked out of the sky. El Salvador's own national story was full of ghosts. The massacre of 1932 had taught indigenous people and peasant farmers that survival could require silence. The poor knew what the state could do when it felt threatened. So the War of 1969 carries a cruel twist. The same kind of military power that once crushed the rural poor now presented itself as their protector. Pain could be used against Honduras. Honduras also wrapped itself in protection. It spoke of defending Honduran land, Honduran workers, and Honduran sovereignty. Those concerns had emotional force, but the response turned Salvadoran families into targets. Once a migrant is painted as an invader, the seizure of his field can be called reform. The burning of his house can be called an act of anger. His flight can be called restoration. Language does not only describe violence, sometimes it prepares the road for it. From the above, the war appears to be a border conflict. From the stadium, it looks like football madness. From the government palace, it looks like a strategy. But from the road, it looks different. A woman carrying a bundle does not care what historians call the war. A child walking beside her does not know that the Central American common market has collapsed further into mistrust. The child only knows his feet hurt, and the adults keep looking behind them. And the aftermath did not end with the ceasefire. Formal peace would not come until October 30th, 1980, and even then the land, island, and maritime disputes had to be referred to the International Court of Justice. The two countries did not settle everything simply because the guns went quiet. Border questions continued to haunt them, and the Gulf of Fonseca remained part of a longer regional argument. El Salvador, meanwhile, absorbed returning migrants into a society already strained by inequality. The land question did not vanish. It settled deeper, waiting for another generation to inherit the pressure. Years later, El Salvador would fall into a far longer and bloodier internal war. The football war did not cause that future by itself. Still, it fed the same furnace: land hunger, military power, displaced people, political exclusion, and a state that often treated poor rural communities as problems to be managed. History does not repeat itself. It repeats like a drum pattern. Different song, same pulse underneath. So when someone says the war began because of football, stop them gently. Do not remove football from the story. Put it in its proper place. Say the game was the mask, the mirror, the public ritual where two wounded nations acted out what land, migration, and fear had already written. Say the matches mattered because symbols matter. But say also that symbols become dangerous when powerful people teach crowds to mistake them for justice. Picture the ball again. Small, white, almost harmless. It rolls on grass, obeying the foot that strikes it. Now zoom out. Around it are packed stadiums, nervous presidents, angry newspapers, border roads, burned farms, old fighter planes, displaced families, and flags lifted like sacred cloth over very human failures. The ball did not choose the war, but men chose to make the ball carry meanings too heavy for sport to hold. The tragedy is that Honduran and Salvadoran poor people were placed against each other when their wounds came from similar roots. Both knew hunger, both knew landowners, both knew military men, both knew promises that arrived dressed nicely and left before dinner. Yet nationalism can make the neighbor into an enemy, while the true architecture of suffering remains untouched. The poor of one country arrived among the poor of another, and the powerful learned how to make poverty accuse itself. That is the lesson hiding inside the football war. Beware the story that is too easy. Beware the headline that makes suffering look ridiculous. Beware the flag when it is used to cover an empty plate. Beware the stadium when the chant becomes a weapon. And beware the politician who discovers the people only when their pain can be aimed at someone else. The war was short, but short things can still be devastating. A spark is short. A scream is short. The moment a family is told to leave is short. The instant a pilot releases a bomb is short. The final breath of a civilian caught between armies is short. History is not measured only by duration. It is measured by what cannot be put back afterward. So, did a war really begin because a ball crossed a line? No, but the ball crossed a line at the exact moment. Two countries were already standing on the edge. Football gave the crisis a costume. Land gave it roots. Migration gave it bodies. Nationalism gave it fire. Governments gave it direction. And the poor, as usual, were asked to pay the bill in blood, exile, and silence. Maybe that is why the name still haunts us. Football war is catchy, but it is incomplete. It remembers the roar and forgets the road. It remembers the score and forgets the family carrying a mattress toward the border. It remembers the burned flag and forgets the burned home. It remembers the game because games are easier to watch than injustice, but the land keeps receipts, even when the world prefers highlights. The final image should not be the scoreboard in Mexico City. Let it be a road after the ceasefire, dust rising around people who no longer know which country will protect them. Let it be an old aircraft disappearing over the hills. Let it be a flag folded beside a mother who has no house to hang it from. Let it be the ball lying silent somewhere behind history, innocent and guilty only because men made it useful. And when you hear someone laugh and say they went to war over football, ask them what the joke is hiding. Ask them about the migrants. Ask them about the land. Ask them about Emilio Bolaños, the martyr who may have been made of paper because the living grief was not dramatic enough. Ask them who benefits when a complicated wound gets renamed as a game, because the danger was never the ball. The danger was the hand that kicked it into a crowd already trained to hate. The danger was the leader who heard that crowd and smiled. The danger lay in the old hunger beneath the new anthem. And the question the football war leaves behind is not whether football can start a war. The question is much darker. When people are already hurting, How little does it take to make them believe the enemy is standing beside them? Thank you. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell because Latin America's most intriguing stories are far from over.